Hello, and welcome to another edition of Hungry for History. I'm Luciana Spracher with the City of Savannah's Municipal Archives, and I'm excited to share some of the history of Savannah's public burial grounds. Today, the City of Savannah Cemeteries Department manages and preserves 5 distinct cemeteries, each with a unique history, and all of which trace back to our first public burying ground, established by Savannah's earliest colonial settlers. In our program today, I'm going to give a brief overview of our public cemeteries from the colonial period through the 5 the city manages now. After this, I hope you will take advantage of all these wonderful assets by visiting and discovering the distinct beauty and history of each. The town of Savannah and colony of Georgia were settled in 1733 with the arrival of General James Oglethorpe and the first round of colonists. Oglethorpe laid out the original town and included Savannah's first public burial ground in Percival Ward within the town's limits. The burial ground was on the lots fronting what is now called Wright Square, just off Bull Street. This cemetery was used for about 17 years. After filling very quickly, it was closed to interments in 1750 when the town established a new burial ground outside the town wall that protected the settlement. The new cemetery was located in what was called the town common, an area used for grazing animals. The first burial ground was then abandoned and all traces of it disappeared as the expanding town developed over it. Today, its original location is marked only by this plaque. The new public burial ground opened in 1750 we now refer to as Colonial Park Cemetery, but over its active use it was referred to by many names, including South Broad Street Cemetery, the Old Brick Graveyard, and Christ Church Burying Ground. Today it is the oldest public cemetery still existing in Savannah. Colonial Park was in active use from 1750 until 1853 and was the burial location for nearly all white people who died in town during that period, from Revolutionary heroes to English loyalists, from governors to scavengers. However, both Jews and people of color were excluded from this burial ground, and we will discuss their separate burial grounds in a few minutes. While fewer than 600 markers and burial vaults exist today, a register of deaths and archaeological investigations indicate that at least 9,000 individuals were buried in Colonial Park Cemetery during its active use. Christ Episcopal Church acquired ownership or oversight of the burial ground in 1758 when Georgia was split into 8 parishes. Savannah became the seat of Christ Church Parish with the burial ground as its official cemetery. The minister for Christ Church took possession of the cemetery, and for the next 98 years Christ Church operated and maintained the cemetery as a public burial ground. The burial ground was expanded 3 times, in 1763, 1768, and finally in 1789 to its current size of 6 acres. In the final 1789 enlargement ordinance, the city specifically stated this was a public burial ground for the interment of all Christian people and should not be considered as belonging to Christ Church. In 1782, the burial ground was incorporated into the city grid, with development now surrounding it. And in the 1790s, a 6-foot brick wall was built to enclose the cemetery, both to protect the burials and the residents living around it. In 1803, the City Board of Health started to keep a death register to record all the burials. Previously, records of deaths and burials were only kept by the town's churches. This death register is preserved in the city's archives. By the late 1840s, this cemetery was also filling up, and citizens were concerned with the cemetery being within the city limits. Citizens petitioned the city government to establish a new, modern burial ground outside the city limits. In response, the city allotted 100 acres of the newly purchased Springfield plantation for the purpose of a public burial ground to be named Laurel Grove. The first sale of lots there took place in 1852. Health officials invited all citizens who had relatives buried in the old cemetery to remove and reinter their family remains in Laurel Grove free of charge. And between 1852 and 1888, as many as 600 burials were removed. Additional remains were removed to the new Evergreen and Cathedral cemeteries. On July 1, 1853, the public cemetery, having reached capacity, was officially closed to interments. There were a few later burials, but they were exceptions. The old cemetery then became a victim of both neglect and vandalism. In 1868, the Old Cemetery Association was formed in the first attempt to preserve the site. In 1887, the Georgia Historical Society made the first attempt to record the grave markers. Progress was a constant threat, with suggestions to extend streets or railroad tracks to the cemetery. There was even a proposal to build the new county courthouse on the property. After discovering that the 1790s brick wall encroached on the lines of South Broad Street, now Oglethorpe, and Abercorn Street, ownership of the cemetery came to a head. The 1758 takeover of the cemetery by Christ Church had caused confusion regarding the legal ownership of the property for over a century. Ownership was finally settled in 1895 by a lawsuit between the City of Savannah and Christ Church. The court ordered Christ Church to sell the cemetery to the city for $6,500, permitted the removal of the 1796 wall, but also required that the graveyard be renamed Colonial Park and be preserved forever as a final resting place of the dead. This stipulation was invoked in 1922 to prevent the city from extending Lincoln Street through the cemetery. As the cemetery officially became Colonial Park Cemetery, the City of Savannah created the Park and Tree Commission and placed Colonial Park under its jurisdiction. A beautification program was begun in 1896, which included laying pathways, installing benches and trash receptacles, and landscaping. P.J. Berkman's Fruitland Nurseries of Augusta was chosen to design the park, setting out 2,000 flowers, trees, and ornamental shrubs during the very first year. Unfortunately, some markers were pulled up for the new walkways, and those, along with other misplaced stones, were mounted on the last remnant of the 1790s brick wall left along the eastern side of the cemetery. This 1906 city map shows all of the city's parklands in green, with the cemetery noted as parkland, indicating the shift in the old burying ground to Colonial Park. In 1913, the Daughters of the American Revolution erected the granite archway at the northwest corner of the cemetery to honor the American patriots interred in Colonial Park. The Georgia Society of the Colonial Dames of America transcribed the epitaphs in 1924, publishing their work in the book Some Early Epitaphs of Georgia. The city erected the current wrought iron railing in 1956, and in 1970, the Trustees Garden Club completed another beautification project. For me, the distinguishing feature of Colonial Park Cemetery, along with its early Georgia history, are the brick burial vaults. There are about 50 extant vaults. The majority of the vault structures are below ground, about 4 to 6 feet. They are constructed like a cellar or basement with brick walls and a paved floor, with tiers of shelves on the sides and a short flight of steps leading down into the vault. Coffins or shrouded corpses were placed on the shelves. Not everyone was included in the original public burial ground on Wright Square, or in what would become known as Colonial Park. In July 1733, about 5 months after Oglethorpe arrived, 42 Jewish colonists landed in Savannah. Shortly after their arrival, Oglethorpe allotted the Jewish community a piece of ground in the town common to bury their dead. Based on a lack of deed or grant in the records, this appears to have been an informal act on his part. The Jewish burial ground was located in what is now the median of Oglethorpe Avenue, near the intersection with Bull Street, and is marked by this monument on the left. There is no exact record of the identity or number of interments in this burial ground. However, it seems to have been in use until at least 1762, when a group of Savannah Jews petitioned the House of Commons for permission to enclose it. By 1770, the plot had reached capacity, when a petition to the House of Commons for additional land and confirmation of Oglethorpe's original allotment was stalled. In response, Mordecai Sheffield created a trust for a Jewish community cemetery in 1773. He chose a portion of a tract granted to him by King George III, located west of Savannah, and conveyed slightly more than 1.5 acres of land to be held in trust as a place for the burial of persons professing the Jewish religion. The Jewish Community Cemetery continued in general use until the mid-1850s, with the last known burial much later in 1881. There is no reliable record of the total number of burials in this cemetery either. African Americans, both free persons of color and the enslaved, were also excluded from Colonial Park Cemetery. In 1789, the Board of Wardens for the City of Savannah passed an ordinance establishing what was referred to in the records as the Negro burial ground. This space was 200 square feet. However, in 1810, a new ordinance was passed appropriating a new space of ground in the South Common, consisting of 330 feet by 264 feet, to be used as a burial space for people of color. The ordinance also made it illegal to bury people of color on any other part of the town common, and levied a fine of $10 for those found in violation. Informers were entitled to half the amount collected from a violator, and the other half of the fine would be used for a fund for enclosing this new burial ground. Little information is available about this cemetery, and no visual evidence of it remains. In 1855, the Savannah Daily Republican reported that the city paid $722 to remove the interments from the old Negro cemetery to Laurel Grove Cemetery, and stated, quote, "The rapid extension of the city southward, the dilapidated condition of the old Negro cemetery, and the rude assaults of the sacrilegious hands upon the repose of the dead rendered it necessary to remove the remains of colored persons to the place appointed for their sepulture near the Laurel Grove Cemetery." End quote. In 1819, the city passed an ordinance setting aside a portion of land for the interment of strangers and others not having relatives within the city of Savannah or buried in the public burial ground. In this 1820 plan of the city, you can see the strangers' burial ground labeled as New Cemetery. In 1839, the city passed a new ordinance to consolidate the various ordinances of the city for the regulations of cemeteries and burial grounds. It clarified that the only public burial grounds to be used were the Brick Cemetery, what we now call Colonial Park, the new cemetery on Abercorn Street, what we are looking at here in the square as the Strangers' Burial Ground, and the burial ground for persons of color, the cemetery we just discussed. The ordinance declared that no persons should be interred in any yard, garden, lot, or other place whatsoever in the city, except in these public cemeteries. Fines for breaking this ordinance would be $30 for a white person and $20 or 30 lashes for an enslaved or free person. In 1844, the City Committee on Health and Cemetery offered a resolution to close the Strangers' Burial Ground and the Negro Cemetery because the ground could not be broken at either site without disturbing the remains of the dead. They offered a resolution to enclose ground belonging to the city further south for two new cemeteries to replace them. City Council adopted the resolution, and the city surveyor was authorized to lay out the new cemeteries. At this time, I have not researched these two later cemeteries, but I believe they were short-lived, being closed when Laurel Grove Cemetery opened in the 1850s. All physical signs of any of the African American cemeteries or the strangers' grounds, sometimes referred to as Potter's Field, are gone, destroyed by development in the 19th century as Savannah pushed southward. The southwest section of Colonial Park Cemetery had been allocated for Catholic burials. However, when Laurel Grove Cemetery was established, Bishop Garland was unable to get a Catholic section established in the new cemetery. So the Catholic diocese purchased 8 1/3 acres from the Reinhardt Plantation in 1853 to establish a cemetery for Catholics in Savannah. Some remains were relocated from Colonial Park to Cathedral Cemetery after it opened. This cemetery is still active and maintained by the Catholic Diocese of Savannah. The city of Savannah acquired the Springfield Plantation in June 1850 from the estate of Joseph Stiles. The property included 960 acres. Drainage improvements allowed the property to be subdivided into lots and sold, but the city reserved 100 acres of high land for a new municipal cemetery. A contest with an award of $100 was held in early 1851, calling for plans for a new cemetery. James O. Morse, a civil engineer in town surveying the new waterworks system, won the contest and was paid an additional $200 to survey the cemetery. William George, a landscape gardener, was employed to carry out Morse's design, and the new cemetery was named Laurel Grove. The northern section of the cemetery was reserved for white Christians, the center for Jews, and the southern section, also the lowest land, was reserved for slaves and free persons of color. On November 10, 1852, Laurel Grove Cemetery was dedicated. Laurel Grove not only helped alleviate overcrowding in the old cemeteries in town, but reused a tract previously considered a detriment to the community, creating a pleasant, park-like setting for people to escape to. All the old cemeteries within the city limits were closed to interments, and the bodies from the Strangers' Burial Ground and the Negro Burial Ground were exhumed and moved to Laurel Grove, where they were placed in mass burials. As stated before, families voluntarily removing their dead from Colonial Park were offered free lots in Laurel Grove. These acts are representative of the difference given in the care and concern of the burials of white residents compared to people of color. In the mid-20th century, Laurel Grove was cut by the 37th Street connector of Interstate 16, which created a physical barrier between the white and African American portions of Laurel Grove, creating two distinct cemeteries, Laurel Grove North and Laurel Grove South, though this was merely reinforcing what had already been occurring since day one, as you can see in the attention to landscape design given to Laurel Grove North compared to Laurel Grove South in the design on the left. Laurel Grove North is characterized by elaborate Victorian mausoleums, statuary, and ironwork, along sandy drives shaded by live oaks and Spanish moss. Much like other cemeteries of the period, Laurel Grove became an extension of the city's park system, attracting residents on the weekends for day trips and picnics. The Ogeechee Plank Road Company laid a plank road, and streetcars ran lines to the cemetery, allowing convenient access from downtown. I think it is the statuary and mausoleums that sets this cemetery apart from the rest in Savannah. And it is Laurel Grove that got me hooked on cemeteries when I was a college student working on a project to do measured drawings of the Screven Mausoleum seen here on the right, a really cool Egyptian revival structure. These are two of the most photographed statues in Laurel Grove North and give you an idea of some of the statuary present in the cemetery. Laurel Grove South, the section reserved for African Americans, was not given the same attention to detail and maintenance as the section reserved for whites, and designers Morse and George apparently gave little attention to this section in their plans. Laurel Grove South began as 4 acres, set apart specifically for the enslaved and free persons of color. In 1857, the section was increased to 15 acres, and later increased to 35 acres. This section was the farthest from the city and the lowest lying land in the cemetery, and drainage continued to be a problem for many years. A fence was erected between the two sections during the early 1900s, further signifying their division, and the physical split of the cemetery by Interstate 16 cemented the social division of the two sections since its establishment. While Laurel Grove North is immediately recognizable for its elaborate grave markers and buildings, Laurel Grove South is more important as a record of Savannah's African American community, documenting aspects of that history ignored by traditional historical media. It is the final resting place of Savannah's African American political and religious leaders, educators, and enslaved persons. Laurel Grove contains more graves of free blacks than any other cemetery in the state of Georgia from the 19th century. The epitaphs provide a lasting legacy and an outdoor history book. Representative of this, and especially significant, are the graves of Andrew Bryan and Andrew Marshall, both of whom were born enslaved and managed to purchase their freedom. In 1783, Bryan was converted to the Baptist faith by African missionary George Laurel, and in 1788 was ordained. He then organized the first African Baptist Church of Savannah. Andrew Marshall was Bryan's nephew and the second pastor of the congregation. Community leader and activist W. W. Law almost single-handedly led the movement to improve Laurel Grove South. He identified historically significant grave sites and pushed the city to maintain the cemetery in a more dignified manner, including providing street names and markers to identify burials. Law's work included leading an NAACP restoration project in the 1970s, addressing the burial plots of leading African American pastors, including that of Andrew Bryant, for which the Historic Savannah Foundation presented him an award. Before W. W. Law died in 2002, he could often be found leading tours in Laurel Grove South, sharing its history with others and serving as its strongest advocate. He was quoted in the Savannah Morning News in 1999 saying, "This cemetery is a historic gem. There is no source that holds as much Black history." There are many things about Laurel Grove South that make it special to me. That it captures so much history not found in the traditional historical record is just one of the things. While Laurel Grove North is almost a riot of Victorian sculpture in windy lanes with overhanging branches and moss, Laurel Grove South has wide open pastoral spaces with many simple vernacular and homemade markers. While all cemeteries can be said to be places for quiet reflection, this one seems even more so with these very personal memorials. Bonaventure Cemetery was originally developed as a private cemetery called Evergreen Cemetery on the former Bonaventure Plantation. Bonaventure Plantation was established in the 1760s by Colonel John Mulrine. The name Bonaventure means good fortune. As he amassed land, Bonaventure Plantation grew to 600 acres. Mulrine didn't cultivate an agricultural crop at Bonaventure, but he planted live oaks every 15 feet along the roadways. Mulrine was appointed Surveyor of Roads, Justice of the Peace, and elected to the Representative Assembly of the Georgia Council. When Royal Governor James Wright fled Savannah in 1776, evading his revolutionary captors, he left from Bonaventure. In October 1779, during the Siege of Savannah, the plantation was used as a landing for French and Haitian troops under Count Charles d'Estaing, and the mansion was used as a hospital for wounded French soldiers. When Savannah was taken back from British control in 1782, the Mulrines were considered British loyalists and traitors and fled to Nassau, and the property was confiscated and sold at public auction to John Haversham. Josiah Tatnall, the Mulrines' grandson, bought the property back in 1785. And in 1846, Commodore Josiah Tatnall III, the final Mulrine descendant to own Bonaventure Plantation, sold the 600 acres to Peter Wiltberger for $5,000. The next year, Wiltberger incorporated 70 acres into the Evergreen Cemetery Company of Bonaventure for a public cemetery. He developed this cemetery around the original plantation, including the Tatnall family burial plot, which had been used since 1794. Evergreen was designed around the ruins of the Tatnall Mansion and utilized the existing live oak tree-lined drives to provide access and separate the major cemetery sections. The first monument erected in Evergreen was for Noble Jones in 1848 and was actually a relocation from Colonial Park Cemetery. The first interment that was not a removal from elsewhere was Peter Wiltberger's own wife, Susan Green Wiltberger, in 1849. In 1907, the City of Savannah purchased Evergreen and renamed it Bonaventure Cemetery. Like Colonial Park, the care and supervision of the cemetery was placed under the Park and Tree Commission, who went about improving the cemetery by shoring up the riverbank and establishing a nursery to supply the cemetery and other city parks. During its first year, nearly 10,000 plants were being cultivated at Bonaventure, including conifers, Cherokee roses, camellias, and hydrangeas. In 2004, the live oaks of Bonaventure were registered on the Georgia Landmark and Historic Tree Register. In 1867, naturalist and author John Muir visited Bonaventure and wrote about his experience in a piece titled Camping Among the Tombs. His description of Bonaventure is quite lovely, and I found it hard to narrow in on just a short quote, so here are a few sections I pulled out from quite a lengthy piece. It is only 3 or 4 miles from Savannah. and is reached by a smooth white shell road. There is but little to be seen on the way in land, water, or sky that would lead one to hope for the glories of Bonaventure. But soon all is changed. You come to beds of purple liatris and living wildwood trees. You hear the song of birds, cross a small stream, and are with nature in the grand old forest graveyard, so beautiful that almost any sensible person would choose to dwell here with the dead, rather than with the lazy, disorderly living. The most conspicuous glory of Bonaventure is its noble avenue of live oaks. They are the most magnificent planted trees I have ever seen, about 50 feet high and perhaps 3 or 4 feet in diameter, with broad, spreading leafy heads. The main branches reach out horizontally until they come together over the driveway, embowering it throughout its entire length, while each branch is adorned like a garden with ferns, flowers, grasses, and dwarf palmettos. But all the plants of these curious tree gardens, the most striking and characteristic is the so-called long moss. It drapes all the branches from top to bottom, hanging in long silvery gray skeins, reaching a length of not less than 8 or 10 feet, and when slowly waving in the wind, they produce a solemn funereal effect singularly impressive. The place is half surrounded by the salt marshes and islands of the river, their reeds and sedges making a delightful fringe. Bonaventure to me is one of the most impressive assemblages of animal and plant creatures I have ever met. Bonaventure is called a graveyard, a town of the dead, but the few graves are powerless in such a depth of life. The rippling of living waters, the song of birds, the joyous confidence of flowers, the calm, undisturbable grandeur of the oaks mark this place of graves as one of the Lord's most favored abodes of life and light. So today, Bonaventure is probably the most popular of the city's municipal cemeteries as a tourist destination, largely due to things like the book Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil and markers like the statue of Little Gracie seen here on the left. But for me, it is the natural beauty of Bonaventure, talked about by Muir in this passage, and its location overlooking the Wilmington River that make it stand out from Savannah's other cemeteries. Greenwich Cemetery is the only municipal cemetery in which the city is still selling burial plots. Adjacent to Bonaventure, the city purchased this property in 1937 for $75,000. Like Bonaventure, Greenwich Plantation started out with a similar revolutionary history. During the Siege of Savannah, French troops led by Count Casimir Pulaski moored their warships in the Wilmington River and joined with American forces on the Greenwich grounds. After an unsuccessful attempt to recapture Savannah from the British, Pulaski was mortally wounded and his retreating soldiers carried him back to Greenwich, where it was said he was buried. These remains were later exhumed and reburied in Monterey Square with the Pulaski Monument. In 1897, Spencer P. Schotter, a wealthy New Yorker and chairman of the American Naval Stores, purchased the Greenwich property. Schotter commissioned the New York City architects of Carrier and Hastings, who had designed the Metropolitan Opera House, to design a 40-room mansion at Greenwich. Schotter's new home was considered one of the finest mansions of the time, rivaled only by the Biltmore. It is reported to have cost $500,000 to build and $100,000 to furnish. The three-story structure was finished in Italian marble, hard woods, and silk walls. It had 12 master bedroom suites and 10 baths. The dining room was 40 feet long and finished in mahogany, while the ballroom was finished in gold leaf. Schotter collected priceless furnishings and art at Greenwich. Two prize pieces included an original painting of Casimir Pulaski and a life-size statue of Eve, second in renown only to the Venus de Milo. The formal gardens were dotted with ancient statuary from Greece and Rome, and supposedly a weeping willow that once hung over the grave of Napoleon on St. Helena. The property consisted of 100 acres and included a dairy farm, pool house, artificial lake, and a long drive leading to the house. It was said that the fountain in front of the mansion flowed with champagne during lawn parties. In 1917, Schotter sold the estate and most of the furnishings and art to Dr. H. N. Torrey of Detroit. Torrey was a surgeon who was in Georgia on a hunting trip when he discovered Greenwich and decided to buy it as a country home. But the Torrey family's ownership of Greenwich was short-lived. On January 27, 1923, a housekeeper discovered a fire caused by a short circuit in an upstairs sewing room. Everyone in the house made a narrow escape, including the Torrey's daughter, who jumped to a safety out of a second-floor window onto a mattress. The mansion burned to the ground at an estimated loss of $500,000, and many priceless works of art were destroyed, including the portrait of Pulaski and the statue of Eve. The statuary in the garden survived and was sold to the city with the property in 1937. A portion of it is on loan and display at the Telfair Museum, where you can see it today. Greenwich's early 20th century history fascinates me more than anything else about this cemetery. Of particular interest to me was its use in the early motion picture industry. For example, around 1915, Under Southern Skies filmed at Greenwich. Early film stars who were filmed at Greenwich include Marguerite Clark, Beverly Bain, Frances X. Bushman, and Mary Pickford. This image on the right is a screen capture from the silent film Stolen Moments, starring Marguerite Namera and Rudolph Valentino. Namera is seen running through Greenwich's garden with the ancient statuary purchased by Schotter. This was the last movie in which Valentino portrays a villain before he breaks out as a major movie star and heartthrob. There are not many visible reminders of Greenwich's heyday when you go out to the cemetery today, with the notable exception of the fountain commissioned by Schotter in 1898. It was created by William Roach of Roach Stone and Monument Company of Savannah. Like nearby Bonaventure, Greenwich also commands expansive views of the Wilmington River. As you can see, Savannah's public cemetery history has been long, dating back to 1733 in General Oglethorpe, and the resulting municipal cemeteries maintained by the City of Savannah today, which trace back to those colonial burial grounds, each have a unique story to tell, and each have distinct characteristics that make them all jewels in Savannah's historic landscape.